Here is the chapter you requested. A flash of lightning illuminated the front porch, revealing the face of a woman distorted by rage. But it wasn't the storm that made Dorothy's heart ache. It was her own daughter. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and let us know where you are listening in the comments. The rain beat a frantic rhythm against the windows of Dorothy's old Victorian home. Inside, the sound was muffled by the heavy drapes, but the house still felt like it was drowning. She padded into the kitchen in her house slippers, the familiar scent of old wood and cinnamon now gone. The room was cold, stripped of its warmth. She pulled open the refrigerator door, the interior light casting a sterile glow on a single bottle of ketchup and a jar of mustard. Nothing else. Not a single carton of eggs, no milk, no leftovers from last night. She had just gone shopping yesterday. A prickle of confusion turned to a cold knot of dread. She moved to the pantry. She pulled the door open, her hand shaking slightly as she reached for the handle. The shelves were bare. The neatly stacked canned goods, the bags of flour and sugar, the boxes of cereal she kept for the grandkids, all of it was gone. Her gaze fell on the stove. A quick inspection confirmed her fear. The gas line was disconnected, the cap left loose and unsealed. A faint, almost imperceptible odor hung in the air, but Dorothy knew what it was. This wasn't an accident. This was an act of deliberate cruelty. Through the window she could see her daughter, Vanessa, on the porch. Vanessa's face was a mask of furious impatience as she banged on the glass, her voice a shrill cry cutting through the storm. "Sign the deed tonight, Mum, or eat what?" The words were a brutal punch. Dorothy's eyes narrowed, but her expression remained calm. She did not scream or argue. Her mind, a finely tuned instrument, processed the information with surgical precision. They wanted her to panic. They wanted her to feel desperate, to give in. But they had miscalculated. She was a woman who had weathered far worse storms than this. Instead of answering Vanessa, Dorothy took a deep breath, fighting the sharp, bitter pain that shot through her chest. It was the pain of a mother betrayed by her own children. She pulled out her phone and dialed a number. 911, she said, her voice steady and low. "I have a gas leak. My daughter disconnected the stove and left the gas line open." Within minutes, the wail of sirens sliced through the night. The flashing red and white lights of a fire truck painted the faces of her neighbors, who were drawn out of their homes by the commotion. They stood on their lawns, huddled under umbrellas, their whispered questions reaching Dorothy's ears even through the window. She watched their curious, confused faces and felt a strange sense of vindication. This was no longer just her secret burden. Vanessa's face, a moment ago so full of triumph, now held a hint of panic. She hadn't expected this public spectacle. She hadn't expected Dorothy to call the authorities. She thought her mother would buckle, would give in to the pressure of hunger and fear. Dorothy watched her daughter's face. She didn't need to yell. She didn't need to cry. She just needed a quiet thought, a promise to herself that this would not stand. You think hunger signs faster than pens? She thought about how they had misjudged her, how they believed a little physical discomfort would make her surrender the house, the one thing her late husband had left her. She would show them. Just then, a black truck pulled up to the curb, its headlights cutting through the rain. It was a U-Haul moving truck. A collective gasp rippled through the neighbors as Officer Reed, a young patrolman, arrived and began setting up a perimeter. He and the firefighters worked quickly, sealing off the area. A moment later, the driver's side door of the truck opened. It was Caleb, Dorothy's son. He stepped out, his face pale and slick with rain. He took a few steps toward the house, but stopped dead in his tracks. His eyes, wide with disbelief and shock, were not fixed on his mother, but on the flashing lights and the firefighters. His gaze then fell to the gaping hole in the driveway where his truck should have been. The back of the truck was open. A neighbor, standing closer to the curb, let out a soft exclamation of surprise. Inside the truck were a microwave, a set of pots and pans, and a few familiar-looking jars. It was Dorothy's kitchen. Caleb stepped out of the truck and into the cold rain, his eyes darting between the fire engines and the group of neighbors huddled together. The gas line was disconnected and secured now, but the sirens continued to wail, a shrill and accusatory sound. As he approached his mother, he saw the camera light from a neighbor's phone. He straightened up and adopted a wounded expression. "Mom, what are you doing?" he demanded, his voice carrying just enough to reach the small crowd. "You're scaring everyone." Vanessa, dripping wet, joined him. She glared at Dorothy, her eyes full of venom. "This is crazy," Vanessa said, addressing the neighbors more than her mother. "She's confused. She took all the food out herself and disconnected the gas. She's a danger to herself." A low murmur rippled through the onlookers. A woman in a floral bathrobe whispered something to her husband. It was about old age. Dorothy saw the pity in their eyes, the same pity she had been fighting for months. Her hands, clasped together in front of her, trembled almost imperceptibly. But she did not cry. She would not give them that satisfaction. Tears were a luxury she could not afford, a weakness they would exploit. The only thing they would see from her was a face of calm, controlled resolve. She had to show them they were wrong, not just about the gas line, but about her sanity. Vanessa stepped forward, a forced smile on her face. She held up a document. "We've been trying to help her. This is a quitclaim deed. She's been getting so forgetful. We've been trying to convince her to let us help her with her affairs." She leaned in closer to a woman with a kind face, her voice dropping to a theatrical whisper. "She wouldn't even let us give her money to eat. We offered to give her $500 for groceries if she would just sign this. Just $500 to help her." $500. Dorothy's mind replayed the number, a small, insulting sum for the home she and her husband had built together. The home filled with a lifetime of memories, the home Vanessa was trying to steal. A tremor ran through Dorothy's body. She felt like a tree in a hurricane, but she would not fall. She turned and walked back into the house, leaving the chaos behind. The cold air inside the house felt different now. It was no longer sterile. It was a sanctuary. She went to the bookshelf in the living room and pulled down an old, worn recipe book. The cover was a pale yellow, its pages stained and dog-eared. It was a book her husband, John, had handwritten for her after their first child was born. He had filled it with his favorite recipes, his neat handwriting a constant, loving presence. On the inside cover was a faded photograph of him standing in this very kitchen, beaming. Next to it was another photo, one he had taken of her younger self, laughing, surrounded by the chaos of a busy kitchen, a stove that had always worked perfectly, a refrigerator that had always been full. She hugged the book to her chest, the brittle paper a fragile comfort against the ache in her heart. This was all they had left her. The memories, the little things that defined their life together, the things her children had now tried to sell off. The very idea of it was a physical blow. The feeling was a deep, guttural pain that settled in her bones, a grief for what was being lost, what was already gone. This was not a passing moment of forgetfulness. It was a calculated, heartless betrayal. The quiet of the house was punctuated only by the distant sirens and the pounding rain, a mournful drumbeat. Suddenly, a soft knock came from the back door. Dorothy opened it a crack. It was Nancy. The young woman's face was earnest and concerned. "Mrs. D," Nancy whispered, her eyes wide. I just saw what happened. I'm so sorry. Dorothy gave a faint smile. She knew Nancy was on her side. It's okay, dear, Dorothy said. I'm okay. Nancy took a step closer, her voice dropping to a low, conspiratorial murmur. I think I might know where some of your things went. I saw some of them, just now, posted on Marketplace. The small comment landed like a rock in a pond. The ripples spread quickly through Dorothy's calm exterior. She gripped the recipe book tighter. This was it, the confirmation she had needed, the proof. The storm raged outside, mirroring the one brewing inside the small town. Caleb and Vanessa, sensing the shift in public opinion, decided to go on the offensive. They launched a full-scale public relations attack against Dorothy, painting a picture of a frail, confused old woman. Caleb stood on the porch, addressing the remaining neighbors. We are so worried about Mum. She's been struggling for a while. We even found out she owes the local grocery store over $1,000. That's why she can't afford food. The number, an audacious lie, hung in the air. The crowd shifted uneasily. The narrative was simple and effective. A vulnerable mother, a caring but overwhelmed son. Caleb's words struck at the heart of their fears about aging and loss of control. He pulled out a crumpled list of groceries, waving it in the air. We've tried to help her, but she refuses. She won't even let us buy her food. Just then, a small voice cut through the bluster. It was Nancy, holding up her phone. That's not true. She paid for everything. Nancy showed them a photo on her phone of a bank statement. The digital receipt clearly showed a transaction from Dorothy's account at the local grocery store for groceries. It was proof that Dorothy had, in fact, been paying for everything. The crowd murmured and looked at Caleb, who suddenly looked flustered. A new face entered the fray. It was Mr. Goldberg, Dorothy's neighbor, a man who had an uncanny knack for numbers. He had been quietly listening, a thoughtful expression on his face. As a retired accountant, he had an instinct for financial deception. While Caleb and Vanessa were busy creating their false narrative, Mr. Goldberg was already working behind the scenes. He had gone online and, using his expertise, cross-referenced the marketplace listings with publicly available information. He had found a string of payments flowing directly from the online sale platform into Vanessa's digital wallet. He spoke in a quiet but firm voice. Poor planning isn't elder care, Vanessa. It's theft. His words, simple and direct, cut through the lies like a knife. The crowd went silent. Mr. Goldberg's reputation was well known in the neighborhood. He was a man of integrity, and his words carried weight. Vanessa's carefully constructed facade began to crack. She glared at Mr. Goldberg, but he met her gaze without flinching. It was in this moment of raw tension that a black sedan pulled up to the curb. Detective Laura emerged, her trench coat slick with rain. She was all business, her eyes scanning the scene, taking in the shocked faces and the tense standoff. She walked directly to Dorothy, ignoring the others. She spoke in a low voice, but her words were clear and commanding. Mrs. Peterson, I understand what is happening here. I need to get this resolved for you. Will you give me power of attorney to investigate this further? Dorothy looked at the detective, then at her children, who were now standing frozen in place. They were trapped. This was no longer just a family squabble. This was a criminal investigation. The rain began to slow, the storm passing, but a different kind of darkness had settled over the scene. The facade of the caring children had crumbled, exposing a greed that was shocking in its brazenness. The neighbors watched in disbelief. They had seen something truly ugly, a side of human nature they had only read about. Dorothy looked at her children one last time, at their desperate, defeated faces. Then she turned to Detective Laura. The answer was a quiet, firm nod. The nod of a woman who had been pushed too far, who had no tears left to shed, and who was now ready to fight back. The air in the house was still, heavy with the quiet tensions that followed a confrontation. Dorothy led Detective Laura into her home, past the empty spaces where her kitchen utensils and groceries once were. The officer's expression was unreadable as she took in the stark emptiness. "I need you to show me what you have, Mrs. Peterson," Laura said, her voice calm and professional. Dorothy nodded. She pulled out her iPad and opened a specific app. On the screen was a neat, digital inventory of her pantry and refrigerator. It was an app her late husband had helped her set up, a small comfort and a way to feel connected to him. She tapped the screen, showing a detailed log of every item that had been in her kitchen, with dates and timestamps for each entry. "I keep a log of everything," Dorothy explained. "It's a habit from my years as a church treasurer. Everything is accounted for." Laura leaned in, her eyes scanning the list. She saw the full inventory of canned goods, a detailed list of frozen meals, even the brand of milk and bread. Then she saw it. The entire inventory had been digitally removed in one fell swoop, a single entry with a timestamp from the previous afternoon. It was a digital ghost of what had been there. Dorothy had not been confused. She had been robbed. "This is good, Mrs. Peterson," Laura said, her tone shifting slightly. She took out a notepad and began to write. "Do you have anything else?" "I have this," Dorothy said, her voice firm. She reached into the pocket of her sweater and pulled out a small, flat tracking device. It was an AirTag. She opened the Find My app on her iPad, and the screen immediately showed a little blue dot pinging from a location on the outskirts of town. "I put it in a box of old kitchen gadgets I had, just to keep track of them." She did not tell the detective the real reason. She had put it there because she had been growing suspicious for weeks. Things had been disappearing, small at first, and then larger. A beloved bread maker, a set of knives, her stand mixer. She had felt crazy at times, but her gut had told her something was wrong. So she had planted a seed, a tiny piece of technology that would tell her the truth. Laura looked at the screen, her eyes lighting up with a quiet excitement. "A storage facility," she murmured. "That's exactly what it looks like." Dorothy had one more piece of the puzzle. She opened another app on her iPad. It was her home security system. She navigated to the video feed from a hidden camera she had placed in her pantry, disguised as a sugar dispenser. "I wanted to see who was taking my sugar," Dorothy said with a half smile. "I have a sweet tooth." Laura watched the short clip. The video showed Vanessa and Caleb standing in the pantry, a box of Dorothy's pots and pans at their feet. Vanessa held a small stack of bills in her hand. She was counting them, her face lit up with a grin. Caleb stood beside her, his face grim but satisfied. The audio was clear. "This is more than we thought," Vanessa said, her voice a little too loud. Caleb nodded. "It's a start. We'll have the house soon." The video was short but damning. It showed not a moment of desperation, but of cold, calculated greed. It was the final piece of evidence. The quiet, professional demeanor of the detective was replaced with a focused intensity. "This changes things," Laura said, pocketing her notebook. "This is not just a family dispute. This is elder abuse and conspiracy. You were right to call us, Mrs. Peterson." Dorothy felt a wave of relief wash over her. The burden she had been carrying for weeks, the doubt and the fear, began to lift. She was not crazy. She was not confused. She was a woman fighting for her home and her dignity. "I need 24 hours, Laura said, her eyes locked on Dorothy's. "I need time to set a trap. They think they've won. Let them think that." Let's lure them in. The quiet suburban house, once a scene of domestic betrayal, was now the center of a criminal investigation. And Dorothy, the supposed victim, was the mastermind of the counterattack. The storm had passed, leaving behind a sky of bruised purple and a silence that felt unnervingly calm. Inside the house, Dorothy and Detective Laura worked quietly, a well-oiled machine of strategy and precision. The evidence was damning, but it was just the first layer. Dorothy knew that to truly win, she had to dismantle Vanessa and Caleb's plans from every angle. The first step was a preemptive strike. Dorothy, with Laura's guidance, drove to the bank. She met with the branch manager and signed a formal fraud alert, a legal document warning the bank and the courts of a potential scam against her. It was an official declaration that any future transactions, especially those involving the sale of her home, should be met with extreme scrutiny. She was no longer a confused old woman. She was a client, a legal entity with rights she was ready to exercise. Back home, another front opened. Mr. Goldberg, ever the silent guardian, had completed his own investigation. He submitted a tip to the IRS detailing the significant income Vanessa had generated from the online sales of Dorothy's property. He included timestamps, item descriptions, and the direct payment transfers. It was a pressure campaign from the back end, a slow and methodical squeeze that would add tax evasion to Vanessa's growing list of problems. Meanwhile, on the town's local Facebook page, Nancy's campaign was gaining traction. What started as a small, kind gesture had exploded into a community-wide event. The page was flooded with photos of neighbors and local businesses pledging to help. The hashtag #FillDorothy'sFridge was everywhere, transforming a private tragedy into a public cause. The local news had even called Nancy, asking for an interview. The public narrative was turning against Vanessa and Caleb, and there was nothing they could do to stop it. As the pieces of the trap fell into place, a subtle but brilliant twist was revealed. Dorothy, with a knowing smile, showed Laura a set of documents. They were legal papers for a limited liability company, the Willow Lane Trust. The LLC owned the commercial property where Vanessa's real estate office was located. Dorothy was not just a homeowner, she was Vanessa's landlord. It was a masterful stroke of planning, a secret kept for years, waiting for this exact moment. "I acquired it a few years ago," Dorothy explained, her voice steady. "I had a feeling she was getting too comfortable. I wanted to make sure I always had an ace up my sleeve." The final step was a quiet, almost poetic act of retribution. Dorothy drafted a formal letter to the State Real Estate Board, a governing body that held the power to revoke Vanessa's license. She attached the video from the hidden camera in her pantry, the clip showing Vanessa and Caleb counting the money. The letter detailed the ethical violations, the fraud, and the abuse of a client's trust, and ended with a formal request for an immediate investigation. The storm had passed, but the real chaos was about to begin. Dorothy was no longer a victim waiting for help. She was a woman of foresight, of quiet strength, and of immense power. The stage was set. The trap was ready. The following afternoon, a tense silence settled over the quiet suburban street. The storm had given way to a bright, clear day, but a different kind of darkness loomed. Caleb and Vanessa, fueled by a mixture of desperation and false confidence, arrived at Dorothy's front door. They held a folder filled with papers, their expressions a mix of practiced concern and thinly veiled impatience. They had brought a document with them, a pre-printed temporary guardianship contract. Their plan was simple: get Dorothy to sign, claiming she was a danger to herself, and take legal control of her life and her assets. They believed the previous night's display of gas tampering would be enough to convince a judge. They had no idea the trap that was already set for them. Dorothy, standing in her doorway, met their gaze with a calm smile. A group of neighbors stood on the sidewalk, their phones discreetly raised, recording. The live stream Nancy had started was still running, and the community was now watching, waiting. Vanessa saw the phones, and her smile faltered for a moment, but she quickly regained her composure. She stepped forward, the contract in her hand. "Mum, we are here to help you," Vanessa said, her voice dripping with an insincere sweetness. "We found this document for your own safety. We need you to sign it so we can make sure you're taken care of." Caleb stood behind her, his arms crossed, a smug look on his face. He thought they had won. He thought they had cornered his mother. Dorothy's smile widened. She shook her head slowly. "You practiced signatures. Try practicing consequences." The words were a quiet bomb. They exploded in the air between them. Vanessa and Caleb's faces went pale. They hadn't expected their mother to be so sharp, so clear. They had expected her to be broken, to be afraid. They had no idea that her strength was a quiet, relentless force. Hidden in a black sedan parked down the street, Detective Laura watched the scene unfold. She was observing every expression, every move. Her partner, Officer Reed, was positioned nearby, ready to move. This was the final act, the climax of their little drama. Caleb, desperate to salvage the situation, started to argue. "Mom, this is for the best. You're not thinking straight." But before he could say another word, a low rumble began to shake his U-Haul truck. The truck, which was still parked on the street, began to vibrate. The noise grew louder, more frantic. The AirTag inside the box of kitchenware was pinging, its location sending a signal to a central command. The tiny device, a simple piece of technology, was now a loud, insistent alarm. The pinging sound became a jarring, rhythmic beat. It was a physical manifestation of the lie they had told, a siren of their own making. Caleb's eyes widened in horror. He knew what it was. He knew what it meant. He turned and tried to run, to get to the truck, to turn off the signal. But it was too late. In the sedan, Detective Laura gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. A signal. Officer Reed moved into position, blocking Caleb's path. The trap had been sprung. The vibrating pulse from Caleb's U-Haul truck became a drumbeat of his own undoing. Officer Reed stood in his path, a calm, immovable force. The neighbors, watching from their lawns, had their phones trained on the scene. This was no longer a private family dispute. It was a public spectacle, and the climax was just beginning. Dorothy, standing in her front yard, felt a surge of strength. It was time to unveil the truth, to expose the lies. She held up her iPad and connected it to a portable projector Nancy had brought, beaming a brilliant image onto the side of her house. It was a digital statement from her bank, a clear, concise document that showed a monthly payment of $1,350. "For 4 years," Dorothy's voice rang out, clear and steady, "I have paid my own mortgage, every month and every utility bill. The money came from my account, not theirs." The image on the house facade changed, showing receipts for electricity, water, and heating, all paid from her account. The crowd gasped. Caleb, who had been trying to get past Officer Reed, froze. His face went pale, the smug mask of a moment ago replaced by a look of sheer, gut-wrenching shock. The foundation of his and Vanessa's entire plan, the lie that Dorothy was incapable of managing her own finances, had just been publicly demolished. But the most shocking moment was yet to come. Detective Laura, still in her car, pulled out her phone and began a live stream. Her face, stern and professional, appeared on the side of the house next to Dorothy's documents. The feed was live from a location on the outskirts of town. A raid. The camera panned, revealing a storage unit being forced open. "This is a search warrant," Laura's voice boomed from the projector. "We have a tip that stolen property is being held here." The door of the storage unit flew open, and a team of officers entered. The camera followed them, revealing a scene that made the crowd on the street gasp in unison. Inside the unit were neatly stacked boxes, and inside the boxes were Dorothy's things. Her copper pots, her fine china, her silver flatware. One of the officers held up a bread maker, turning it slowly. A light from a small device in his hand cast a beam over the item, and a small, glowing mark appeared. "The items were marked with UV ink," Laura said, her voice a cold, hard hammer. "Every item. Every one of them." The screen shifted again, showing a detailed list of all the stolen items, along with their estimated sale price. The total was $9,200. The numbers, simple and undeniable, hung on the side of Dorothy's house for all to see. Caleb, his face ashen, saw his life crumbling before his eyes. He had lied, cheated, and manipulated, and now all of it was laid bare. He saw the police, the cameras, the shocked faces of his neighbors, and he knew there was no escape. He turned to run, but Officer Reed was ready. The young officer moved quickly, blocking Caleb and pinning him against his truck. "Caleb Peterson," Officer Reed said, his voice firm. "You're under arrest, and tampering with a gas line is a separate offense." The words hit Caleb like a physical blow. He crumpled against the side of the truck, his head in his hands. He was caught. Not just for the theft, but for the dangerous, reckless act that could have killed his own mother. Vanessa, standing on the porch, watched in horror. The perfectly crafted narrative she and Caleb had built had fallen apart. The public spectacle, the undeniable evidence, the arrest. It was all too much. "You can't do this to us," Vanessa whispered, her voice a choked, broken sound. Dorothy, her face filled with a quiet, sorrowful resolve, looked her daughter straight in the eyes. "I'm not doing this to you," she said. "You've done it to yourselves." The street remained a tableau of stunned disbelief. The neighbors, still holding their phones, watched as Officer Reed placed Caleb in the back of his patrol car. The air was thick with the silent aftermath of a public collapse. Vanessa, her face a mask of furious denial, turned to Detective Laura. "You can't do this," she spat. "You can't just arrest my brother based on some old lady's delusions." Laura's expression was cold, clinical. She took out her own phone. "This is not a delusion, Vanessa. You and your brother are under investigation for elder abuse, identity fraud, and criminal conspiracy." She held up a second phone, a cheap burner phone that had been found on the floor of Caleb's truck. "And on this, we have your draft of a fake power of attorney and quit-claim deed. They're a perfect match to the one you were trying to get your mother to sign." The legal hammer had fallen. Vanessa's face crumpled. She had been so careful, so manipulative, but she had been caught by her own sloppy greed. The two documents she had meticulously crafted were now her undoing. Meanwhile, on another front, the financial world closed in on them. Mr. Goldberg, standing a few feet away, held up a tablet. His face was grim, a stark contrast to his usual amiable demeanor. "I just sent this over to the DA's office," he announced, his voice carrying clearly. The screen showed a spreadsheet detailing Caleb's significant gambling debts, a staggering $27,000. Below that, a title loan for $15,000, taken out on his truck, using a forged signature. "The money from your mother's belongings was clearly going to pay off these debts, Caleb," Mr. Goldberg said, addressing the back of the patrol car. The numbers don't lie. The final piece of their public downfall was a human one. Nancy's "Had Fill Dorothy's Fridge" campaign had gone viral overnight. As Detective Laura was speaking, a line of cars began to pull up to the curb. Neighbors and strangers from the next town over began to unload bags of groceries, casseroles, and homemade bread. A reporter from the local news station arrived, his camera crew in tow, and began to film the scene. The image of the empty house from the night before was now being replaced by an image of a community coming together. It was a powerful counter-narrative, one that no amount of lying could erase. Vanessa watched the food being piled onto Dorothy's porch, the cameras flashing, the community rallying around her mother. She felt a deep, burning resentment. This was supposed to be her victory, her inheritance. She had lost everything. "You can't ruin my license," Vanessa said, her voice a desperate, pleading whisper, all confidence gone. "My career." Dorothy, who had been watching the scene with a quiet dignity, finally spoke. Her voice was calm and steady. "I'm not ruining your license, Vanessa. Your ethics did that." The words hung in the air. Vanessa looked at her mother, then at the cameras, at the neighbors with their kind but judgmental eyes. The carefully constructed life she had built on lies was collapsing. She turned and ran to her car, speeding away from the scene of her own destruction, leaving Caleb in the back of the police car and her mother in the arms of a community she never appreciated. The initial shock of the public collapse had worn off, replaced by a new, more insidious game. Vanessa, stripped of her professional dignity and public reputation, retreated to her last line of defense. She filed a formal petition for guardianship, a legal maneuver that, if successful, would grant her complete control over her mother's life and assets. The paperwork, slick and professionally bound, was a final, desperate attempt to win. It was a vicious move, a direct assault on Dorothy's cognitive abilities. The filing accused Dorothy of severe cognitive decline, citing her failure to manage her own home and her irrational public behavior. The document painted a picture of a woman losing her mind, a person who needed to be protected from herself. Vanessa, in her final act of calculated cruelty, believed this was the one accusation her mother could not disprove. After all, who would believe a woman in her 70s was in full control of her faculties against a professional's claim? But Vanessa had once again underestimated her mother. Dorothy was not just a woman of foresight. She was a woman of meticulous preparation. She had seen this move coming a mile away. Dorothy responded not with an argument, but with irrefutable evidence. She presented a recent, comprehensive neurological evaluation conducted by one of the top specialists in the state. The report was an exhaustive document detailing her sharp memory, her clear reasoning, and her robust cognitive health. It was a cold, clinical rebuttal to Vanessa's claims. Accompanying the report was a piece of evidence that was far more powerful than any legal document. It was a video. The clip, filmed by Nancy just a week prior, was of Dorothy teaching a group of children at the local church. She was at a whiteboard, her face lit up with a genuine smile as she explained a complex math problem. She moved with ease and grace, her voice patient and her mind as sharp as a tack. She was a teacher, a mentor, a person full of life and joy. The video ended with the children cheering, their bright laughter a living counterpoint to Vanessa's grim accusations. The tension in the quiet street began to build again, but this time it was not just a social drama. A fierce, sudden thunderstorm rolled in, a physical manifestation of the emotional turmoil. The sky turned a bruised purple. Sheets of rain hammered the roof, and the wind howled through the old trees. The electricity in the neighborhood began to flicker. One moment, the house was bathed in light. The next, it was plunged into darkness, the only illumination the frantic strobe of lightning outside. The power came back on, but as it did, a new sound cut through the storm, a high-pitched, insistent beeping. It was the gas alarm, a stark, terrifying reminder of the events of a few nights ago. The sound was an electric pulse in the quiet room, making Dorothy's heart race with a new kind of anxiety. It was not just a sound, it was the memory of a threat, a final taunt from her children. The beeping continued, a rhythmic and menacing metronome. The air was thick with the scent of ozone and the fear of what might happen. The sound was designed to break her, to make her feel once again like the frightened old woman they imagined her to be. Just then, a new sound cut through the noise. A phone. It was Vanessa's phone. It rang with a loud, demanding tone, a jarring note in the symphony of the storm. Vanessa, who had been standing with her back to Dorothy, turned, her face a mask of annoyance. She had been so sure she had won. Now this unexpected call was a disruption. She fumbled with the phone, pressing it to her ear, then quickly putting it on speakerphone, a desperate attempt to show her mother that she had nothing to hide. The voice that came through the speaker was cold and dispassionate, a voice that carried the weight of a final, irrevocable decision. The storm raged outside. The gas alarm continued its insistent beeping. The voice on the phone was the calm eye of the hurricane. It was the voice of a man who held all the power, a man who would not be swayed by emotion or pleading. It was the landlord. And his voice was saying something that made Vanessa's face turn ashen. The phone rang, its shrill tones slicing through the chaos of the storm and the blare of the gas alarm. Vanessa, her face a mask of furious concentration, snatched it up. She had been so sure of her legal maneuver, so certain that the guardianship petition was her final trump card. She put the call on speakerphone, a defiant gesture toward her mother. The voice that came through was calm and authoritative, a jarring contrast to the frantic energy of the room. It was the voice of Mr. Harrison, the owner of the office building where Vanessa's real estate business was located. "This is a formal notice, Ms. Peterson," Mr. Harrison's voice said, sounding distant and cold. "Effective immediately, your lease for the office space at 345 Oak Street is terminated. We will be issuing a formal letter in the morning." Vanessa's jaw dropped. "You can't do that," she shrieked into the phone. "You have no right." The man on the other end of the line did not raise his voice. "I have every right. There is a morals clause in your lease agreement. We have received undeniable evidence of unethical business practices and elder abuse, which is a gross violation of your contract." "This is a lie," Vanessa yelled, her voice breaking. "You are listening to a crazy old woman." Mr. Harrison's voice was as flat as a straight line. "That is not what the evidence suggests. You have until noon tomorrow to vacate the premises. The locks will be changed." With that, he hung up. Vanessa stared at the phone, her face ashen with shock. The gas alarm continued to beep, but the sound was now a distant hum compared to the ringing in her ears. She turned to Dorothy, her eyes wide with a mix of fury and disbelief. "You did this," she said, her voice a low growl. "You told them." Dorothy watched her daughter's face. She felt no triumph, only a quiet, sad certainty. She reached up and calmly took off her rain hat, setting it on the small table next to her. She looked Vanessa directly in the eyes. "He does," Dorothy said, her voice clear and without a trace of emotion. "I'm the landlord." The words were a physical blow. Vanessa's body went rigid, her mouth falling open in a soundless gasp. The truth, so simple and so devastating, hung in the air between them. Her mother had not just been a passive victim. She had been a ghost in the machine, a silent partner, a woman with a plan so meticulous and so clever that it was almost invisible. The Willow Lane Trust, the LLC. Her entire life had been a series of carefully constructed layers, and Vanessa had just walked through every single one. The realization was a weight, a heavy, suffocating blanket of defeat. But the finality of it was not yet complete. A new notification appeared on Vanessa's phone, a notification from her own state real estate board. She looked at it, her fingers trembling. The words blurred on the screen, but the meaning was clear. Her license was being temporarily suspended, pending an investigation. The legal system, the financial system, and now her own professional life. All of it was collapsing at once. The dominoes, set in motion by her mother's quiet hand, were falling in a thunderous, irreversible crash. Caleb, who had been standing silently in the doorway, collapsed onto the floor. He sat there, his head in his hands, defeated and broken. He had been so sure he was a step ahead, so certain that his mother was helpless. Now, he was a man with no home, no job, and no dignity. Vanessa, her face a blank canvas of shock, looked at her brother, then at her mother. All her plans, all her schemes, were gone. She had nothing. "We still have the house," Vanessa whispered, a final, desperate gasp of hope. Dorothy smiled. It was a gentle smile, not of victory, but of a quiet, unshakable resolve. "About that," she said. Dorothy's smile was a quiet, final act of a woman who had meticulously planned her own salvation. "About that," she had said, and the words hung in the air, a final cliffhanger in the long, drawn-out drama of her life. She walked to the living room and picked up a large framed photograph of her husband, John. Her voice was strong, filled not with anger, but with a deep, resolute peace. "Your father and I worked our entire lives for this house. It was our home, our legacy. It was never meant to be a bargaining chip for you to sell off for quick cash." She set the photograph down and turned to a small safe, the one her children had always assumed was empty. She worked the combination, her fingers moving with a practiced ease. She pulled out a stack of documents and laid them on the coffee table. These weren't just legal papers. They were the keys to her freedom, the final, undeniable proof that her children's greed had led them down a path they could not escape. "4 years ago," Dorothy said, her voice a calm narrative, "I put this house into an irrevocable community pantry trust. It is no longer my property. It belongs to the town's food bank." The news landed like a bombshell. Caleb, who had been sitting on the floor in a state of shock, looked up, his eyes wide with disbelief. Vanessa, who had been frozen in place, took a step back, her hand flying to her mouth. The house they had so desperately tried to steal, the inheritance they had coveted for years, was gone. It was a classic, brilliant twist of revenge, not of a petty, vindictive nature, but of a social and humane one. Dorothy had not just saved her home, she had given it to the community that had supported her. "I have a lifetime tenancy here," Dorothy explained, her voice as clear and as clean as a fresh slate. "I can live here for the rest of my life, but the house cannot be sold. It cannot be mortgaged. It cannot be taken. And it cannot be inherited." The look on Vanessa's face was one of complete and utter devastation. The house, her last hope, was gone. The game was over. The game had been rigged from the start. But the legal ramifications were just beginning. A moment later, the front door opened and Officer Reed re-entered the house. He was holding a pair of handcuffs. He walked straight to Caleb. "Caleb Peterson, you are under arrest for tampering with a gas line and identity fraud." Caleb said nothing. He simply stood up and put his hands out. He was a man with no options left. Officer Reed then turned to Vanessa. Vanessa Peterson, you are also under arrest. You're being charged with conspiracy, elder exploitation, and tax evasion. Vanessa's face went white. The last part, tax evasion, was a quiet, deadly blow from Mr. Goldberg. It was a charge she could not escape, a financial crime that would follow her for the rest of her life. The final fall was social. The live stream from Nancy's phone, the one that had been broadcasting for hours, had gone viral. It had reached over 80,000 views overnight, a number that was still growing. People from all over the state, and even the country, were watching the fall of a woman who had tried to steal from her own mother. Her clients, seeing the public spectacle, began to call her office, one by one, to cancel their contracts. Her reputation, the one she had so meticulously built, was in ruins. The final humiliation was a quiet one. Caleb, in the back of the police car, was taken away. Vanessa, defeated and broken, walked to the curb. As she got into the back of a second police car, she whispered, "I just want to talk to Mum." Caleb looked up at his mother from the floor, his face ashen, his body defeated. Vanessa stood a few feet away, her eyes wide with shock. The house they had so desperately tried to seize was gone. It was a final, undeniable truth. Dorothy, her gaze steady, met her son's eyes. The pain she had carried for so long was still there, a dull ache in her chest. But it was no longer raw. She had a choice to make now, a choice between pure vengeance and a more difficult, more humane kind of justice. She had to show Caleb what it meant to earn back trust, not just with words, but with service. In the days that followed, the legal hammer fell swift and hard. Caleb, who had been taken into custody, was offered a plea deal. It was a restitution plan. It required him to pay back the $9,200 from the sale of the stolen belongings. He was also sentenced to 200 hours of community service at the local food bank. The judge, seeing the potential for redemption, also ordered him to attend a gambling addiction program. It was a second chance, but it was a hard one, a chance to rebuild, not just his life, but his character. Vanessa, facing a far more serious set of charges, was not so lucky. Her conspiracy and elder exploitation charges were devastating. The added charge of tax evasion from Mr. Goldberg's meticulous work was the final nail in the coffin. She was looking at serious jail time, the kind of punishment that would end her career and her freedom. Meanwhile, a new kind of life began to bloom in Dorothy's backyard. She had always had a green thumb, a love for the soil. Now she was using it to heal. She started a pantry garden, a small community project where she and the neighborhood children planted vegetables. The garden was a symbol of hope, of new life growing from a place of barrenness. Caleb, on his first day of community service at the food bank, saw Dorothy from a distance. He was wearing an apron, his hands dirty from sorting canned goods. He had a look of profound humility on his face, the arrogance from before replaced by a quiet, exhausted shame. He asked a supervisor if he could speak with his mother. Dorothy walked over to him. It was their first one-on-one conversation since the confrontation. He looked down at the ground, unable to meet her gaze. "Mom, I'm so sorry," he said, his voice thick with emotion. Dorothy didn't say anything for a long moment. Then she reached out and put a hand on his shoulder. "I'm not going to give you money, Caleb," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "I'm not going to let you live with me. Not now. But you can come to the garden. You can work with me. You can teach the children about planting and growing. That's what you can do." It was a conditional forgiveness, a chance to earn back a piece of her trust, not with words, but with action. It was a profound act of grace, a quiet statement that the path to redemption was through service, not through promises. The story came full circle, a beautiful, quiet moment of healing. As the camera panned over the scene, it showed a long line of neighbors, led by Nancy, bringing food to Dorothy's now full refrigerator. Mr. Goldberg, standing beside his own car with a basket of fresh eggs, gave a small, knowing smile. "Numbers don't lie," he said to a reporter. "Neither do neighbors." The final chapter of this story is not one of a dramatic, vengeful ending, but of quiet healing. It's a story of a woman who chose justice over retribution, of a community that rallied around its own, and of a son who found a long and difficult path toward a second chance. The garden grew, a testament to the resilience of a woman who had lost so much and yet had given so much more. I believe adding a final interactive piece to your story can be a great way to engage your audience and create a lasting impression. Here is a suggested segment you can use at the end of your voice recording. What do you think will happen next for Dorothy and Caleb? Do you believe Caleb can truly find redemption, or is this just the beginning of a long road? Let us know your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more stories of courage and community.